Hello, everyone. This is the 230th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back British lecturer Dr. Peter J. Watson, a lecturer in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies at the University of Leeds. We continue our interview series as we discuss Colombian football, this time covering the period of post 1994 World Cup to 2014 World Cup. Dr. Watson is also the author of Football and Nation Building in Colombia, the only thing that unites us. Welcome back, Peter.
Thank you, Shahan. It's a pleasure to be back again.
So, last time we left off at the end of the 1994 World Cup. What was the state of Colombian football following this World Cup that ended in tragedy with the murder of Andres Escobar?
So I think it is a tragedy. I think that's where we have to start. I think that it has a national impact. I think so much national pride, national stake had been placed towards this football team. There were so many hopes for the nation that they were going to do well. And as we remember, Pele had tipped them as being winners. They'd beaten Argentina 5-0. This was the golden generation at the peak of their powers. It seemingly they didn't have the most difficult group. So there was a lot of hope. Unfortunately, when they lost, unfortunately when Andres Escobar, this became a national tragedy. That we have a period of mourning, we have a period of shock. There is a lot of national introspection. And I think it impacts on the national level. It's not just Andres dying, it's losing to the US, who, has traditionally been seen as a problematic northern neighbor despite political alliances. So I think that what we see is a country that enters into a deep kind of almost a black hole of despair for a period of time. It's not just the loss. We have also Barabas Gomez retires. We have a lot of players who consider their future. Several players don't want to play again for the national team because of the threats that had been given to Maturana, to some of the players. And it really impacts the whole country. This was the hope that was really destroyed. And I remember one quote, there's something like, if we can't beat the US, then what good are we? And someone else describes the whole period from this World Cup really all the way through almost to 2014 as being a black hole, a kind of pit of despondency and despair. And even though they do qualify for 1998, which I'm sure, go on to talk about, it does feel like this was, in lots of ways, the symbolic end of that particular generation, even though some of the players do go on into future tournaments.
After this World Cup, Pacho Maturana left his post, and even the star of the team, Faustino Asprilla, he retired from the national team for a brief period. Was this, as you say, a reference point in more ways than just football?
Yeah, and I think so. I think you have to look at the kind of narratives that were surrounding this World Cup. I mean, the president of Colombia that was in charge, a guy called Cesar Gaviria, had spoken quite a lot after the Argentina game about how this was a team that was showing a new Colombia, a kind of hope for Colombia, a Colombia that could be united. In my book, I talk about this being very much as an idea of a Colombia versus narco Colombia kind of moment. They're trying to counterpoint the two of what Colombia can be in the future. They're trying to cast off all these bad elements of the cartel years, the violence. And in some ways, when Pablo Escobar has been killed in late 1993, there is some idea that maybe this could be a turning point, both through the cartel violence, the problems in Colombia with drugs, but also with the footballers being symbolic of that. So again, when this happens and Andres Escobar gets murdered and all of the rumors are about cartels betting and the control they have, this really magnifies that problem once again, that it isn't suddenly finished, that Colombia does have a lot of deep problems that football can't remedy. Football in lots of ways is a lovely narrative. It's a symbol that kind of blanks out other problems for a period of time, but then reality quickly returns. And I think Colombia really finds that. So then you get really a kind of period of time where the national problems become paramount. We do see more of an attempt to deal with the impact of drugs on society and football in particular. Shortly after, this World Cup, in the next couple of years, we see the arrests of the leaders of the Cali cartel, for example. But what really happens, though, is the drug cartels kind of atomize. We kind of get different leaders popping up. They go slightly more underground. We then have really also the growth of the paramilitaries. So, and what also becomes a problem is that with football having been such a hope in 1994, and then, the team's struggling in lots of ways since, football never quite feels like it becomes as potential a balm to bring the nation together or solve those problems. Football isn't something they can really look to provide the hope, the unity they're really hoping for, because there are too many examples of national problems. The FARC start to gain more power, the paramilitary start to gain more power, different cartels are still an influence. So I wonder that for some period of time, it feels like football has lost its potential pull just because of that pain that was suffered with the 1994 failure.
Maturana's long-term assistant, Hernan Dario Gomez, was appointed as the new national team manager in the aftermath. This signaled continuity as much of the Valderrama era backbone was still intact and Asprilla also returned to the team. So, was the third place in the 1995 Copa America a reflection of the return to normalcy? And we also have in 1995 and 1996, we have teams like Atlético Nacional Medellín and America Cali also reached the final of the Copa Libertadores, although both times they lose to Gremio and River Plate, respectively. So, were these much needed positive signs?
Yeah, I think there's certainly some continuity, but I think what we're having in lots of ways is a gradual decline, given the impact that the drug cartels had, and also the power of that particular golden generation is starting to wane. So these kind of particular years with the Copa America, the Hernan Dario Gomez years, the two teams that you mentioned doing well in the Copa Libertadores, is still evidence that Colombian football still is quite strong. I think that it's important to look in certain contexts, though. I mean, Hernan Dario Gomez, who is known as Bolillo in Colombia, the benefit of having the continuity candidate, if you like, to carry on after Maturana is certainly very beneficial. He knows the players, he has experience. Personally, I never thought he was tactically as astute as Maturana. I felt that he was more of a hothead, less inclined to be more reasoned, potentially. He certainly always felt more temperamental, certainly when I see him, and some of the incidents that happened in his later career would certainly prove that. So I wonder if the lack of the calm head and potentially that might have damaged some of the squad in some way. I think what you also have in 1995 is a fairly weak Copa America group. I don't think it was really that strong. If you look at who they were playing, they had to play against Peru, then Ecuador and Brazil. They drew 1-1 with Peru. They beat Ecuador 1-0 and then lost to Brazil very comfortably 3-0. And actually, that featured another Higuita howler. Actually, if you look back on that goal, on that game, the third goal is very embarrassing from Higuita, the kind of clangor that unfortunately he was capable of. But so when they come third in that tournament, they drew with Paraguay and then beat them on penalties in the quarterfinal and then lost to Uruguay. So really, the third place is a bit of a myth. They don't really beat anyone very good. What you do have a little bit is, I guess, the start of a trying to find a new generation. I think that the 1995 squad, we do see 9 or 10 members from the 1994 team. People like Ivan Cordova, Mendoza, Valderrama is still there, Asprilla is still there, Leonel Alvarez is still there, Victor Aristizabal, Freddy Rincon is still around. But then we have the trouble in replacing them. Some of the players that do come in, people like Bermudez, who was a player for America de Cali and then played very successfully in Argentina, was successful. There are a couple of goalkeepers like Miguel Calero who did quite well, but there's often a struggle to replace some of those really other key players in the national team. So I think that's where Colombia start to struggle. There's a kind of a young generation of which people like Asprilla and there was a guy called Ivan René Valenciano had a very successful national career, had an unsuccessful period in Atlanta. There was supposed to be a good generation that was following the golden generation, but somehow they never quite made it. So I think that 1995 is a little bit of a false dawn. It's really a kind of a sign more that things are starting to quietly fade. That style is going, the manager's not quite as possibly as effective. In terms of the two cup performances in 1995 and 96. I think, again, we've got the remnants of squads who have been strongly linked to the cartels. The money is kind of still there just because for example, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers are arrested, who are the financial backers and cartel leaders, the Cali cartel, doesn't suddenly mean that their influence dissipates. So those two teams are still benefiting from these kind of networks, I suppose, or finances that are still there that haven't really been stopped at source just yet anyway. Again, to some extent, they have fairly friendly groups. The Nacional draw, they play a couple of Chilean teams who at that point aren't quite at their height. We're seeing Chile's kind of stronger teams happen a little bit later than that. They do beat Peñarol. And again, the good performance really comes in a semi-final, but that's a penalty win again. It's a kind of period where Colombians do very well on penalties, actually. And then in the final, Gremio are just too strong. If you look at some of the players in that particular team, you have people like Mario Jardel, who goes on to have a very successful career in Porto. Paulo Nunes, who was a kind of a playmaker. Dinho Danarley, it's a very strong Gremio team. So Nacional can't quite cope. And it's quite similar with America in the following year. They beat a couple of Bolivian teams in the first round. Then they have to play a Venezuelan team in the last 16. So the first kind of phase is quite easy. Then we start to see impressive performances, though. Beating Cerro Porteño, a very strong, very tough Paraguayan side, was very good. Then they beat Gremio, again, the previous year's winners. Slightly weaker, though. A few of the players have gone to Europe by then. But then come up against a River Plate team they've got people like Gallardo. I think Matias Almeida might still be there.
Crespo, I think.
Yeah, he's also there. Obviously, you've got someone like Enzo Francescoli as well, the great Uruguayan playmaker. Sorin is kind of making his way into the game. So that's really a very, very strong River Plate team. And once again, America de Cali fail at the final hurdle. This is after the kind of the near things in the mid 1980s. This was a very painful loss. I think what both of these teams do have though is that they start declining. After these particular years, it's quite a long time before either Nacional or America are the continental force that they have been in the 80s and 90s. I think what's also quite interesting at that time is that we do see a few lesser clubs that are breaking the monopoly of some of the Brazilian and Argentinian teams. So I think it's quite an interesting decade of South American football in the Copa Libertadores anyway.
In September 1995, there's a famous scorpion kick of Rene Higuita in a friendly against England at Wembley. This has become a cultural reference point. On the anniversary of the match, you always have clip of this play on social media. In a way, it feels like this was a symptom of the relative insularity of the day, as anyone vaguely familiar with Higuita's game was not at all surprised, I don't feel. In hindsight, do you feel as a result it may be an overhyped event? Does it have any cultural resonance in Colombia itself?
I mean, it does have cultural resonance in Colombia because it's done at Wembley. It's done against England. It's done against, a former colonial power, the inventors of the game in the temple of football. So I think that whatever happens at Wembley when Colombia playing there, that's still a major event. Colombia still do have a sense of inferiority in lots of ways. So I think there is a need to impress the big European teams. So I think that, this is the second time that Colombia have played England at Wembley. The first one they drew as well, again, 1987 or 88. I can't remember quite
88,
the year.
yeah.
Yeah.
The
So
Rouse Cup, yeah.
so Andres Escobar scores a goal in that game. So you have two famous draws where Colombia goes to the home of football trademark, as English people like to see it, and don't lose either time. And are probably, certainly in the first game, were the better team. In the second game in 1995, it's a very boring game. There's hardly anyone there. It's really the only thing of that game that has any relevance whatsoever. For Colombians, this is not a new thing. I think it's worth saying that Higuita had done this in an advert for Frutinho, kind of powdered fruit juice. I remember I was actually there in Colombia when the advert came out. So it's a really kind of cheesy advert where a little boy is buying this Frutinho and Rene Higuita turns up and they have a kick around the park. And then that's where Higuita does the scorpion kick, I think for the first time. So that's where it gets first known. It obviously adds on to the whole Higuita style of play anyway, with the slightly flamboyant, the playing out from the back, from taking penalties and free kicks. Unfortunately, from doing things that aren't particularly the most sensible at the time, the occasional bloopers will obviously appear as well. So it's not new, but I think what is important, it's the audacity of the moment, it's the venue, it's the fact that it's against England that makes it important for Colombia in terms of just being proud that someone has the courage and guts to do that. The problem I think it has is that it makes him slightly cartoonish to a European and probably wider audience. I think that it becomes his trademark. He does it all the time. Every friendly game he plays after that, and still does, he has to do it once or twice. I mean, apparently, even before that actual game in the warm ups, he was doing it all the time then as well. So I think it makes him, it almost reduces the way he's seen as a good goalkeeper. I mean, I have slight doubts about how good a goalkeeper was in certain ways. I think he's a little bit too unreliable. I don't think he was particularly good to his right hand side. He's certainly a great shot stopper. He was a great penalty stopper as well. I think the way he played was very important for a Colombian system as well. So I think that there is a lot of good things about Higuita as a player, but that moment tends to reduce him to an exotic figure of fun. And when people then go on to talk about the links with the cartels, the error in the 1990 World Cup, it almost takes away from some of the football importance he actually had as well. So I'm not sure it's been quite as good for him, as we may say. But certainly it's a moment that's remembered, and it did have cultural resonance at the time.
The 1998 CONMEBOL World Cup qualifiers were to be the first in a round robin group format, featuring all the nations, well, except in this case, defending champions Brazil. This would be a marathon of nearly a year and a half. And Colombia started brilliantly, inflicting heavy defeats on Uruguay and Chile. However, by the year 1997, Colombia started stagnating after losing to Argentina 1-0 at home with a farcical goal. In the end, Colombia just limped to qualification, courtesy of mostly the positive early form. Was it clear that the Valderrama generation was on the wane at this point?
Yeah, I think definitely so. Valderrama has now gone to play in the USA. He's still got the style. He still is the pivot. He still has the influence, but he certainly wasn't the player he was. Frederic Con's dynamism was starting to wane. You probably don't have that power up front that you really needed. They're still looking to, the likes of Asprilla, Pipo de Avila, Anthony de Avila. El Tren Valencia is a fading force as well. So I think that all of those things are becoming a problem. I think, you can look, in lots of ways, I see that 1998 qualifying group as not one of the stronger ones. I think Uruguay were a fading force at the time as well. You've still got the problems with, Ecuador become a better team in the early 2000s. Peru are not a good team. Venezuela are not a good team. Bolivia are only dangerous at home. Chile are in a better moment. You have Salas and Zamorano becoming two of the greatest strikers in the world at the time. So I think Colombia benefit from a general weakness of the qualifying group, particularly with Brazil not there as well. I think one of the things that's really interesting about that qualifying actually is not the fact they qualified, but the particular goal that almost secured the qualification for them, which is a goal by Anthony de Avila against Ecuador. And what he does after the game, he gets interviewed on the pitch and he actually dedicates the goal to the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, who are the Cali cartel leaders who are currently in jail. Now, there are lots of problems with this. Anthony de Avila is actually playing in the US. He certainly did have links with the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers. He had played for America for a long time. He's one of their kind of historic figures in lots of ways, scored a lot of goals for them. Obviously, Colombia is trying to get rid of its reputation for being a drug country as well. So that type of comment where he's dedicating a goal to the leaders of the Cali cartel goes across incredibly badly. He then actually doubles down and says he doesn't regret it. He says, well, maybe I committed an error, but I'll accept it. I just remembered them, that they gave me advice when I was 19. I wanted to share the happiness in my heart with the people that are now going through a bad moment. And it's not until the third time he speaks out, because he defends himself again, that he actually apologizes. So I think a lot of damage is done. That any attempt where Colombia is trying to rid itself of these links still becomes very apparent. It's worth saying that Anthony de Avila hasn't done well since. He was arrested in drugs charges in 2004 and he's currently in jail, I think in Italy, for drug trafficking charges again when he was caught just 3 or 4 years ago. So he's a very problematic figure. And that's kind of symptomatic, I guess, of a country that hasn't really resolved its past at this time. When we get to the World Cup as well, we see a lot of division in the actual squad. There are certainly fractures between a kind of a Valderrama group, a Rincon group, an Asprilla group. There's a few too many egos going around. And I think also we have a country that is really struggling in itself. The drug issues are still there, but what has become much worse is the paramilitary conflict with the FARC. The paramilitaries have committed a few horrific atrocities in places like El Aro and Mapiripan. In the latter, something like 30 people are murdered and chopped up and dismembered. El Aro is something similar. I think 15 people are murdered and 900 displaced. The FARC are gaining a lot more power as well. The Samper government is incredibly ineffective at dealing with this. There are lots of rumors of corruption and that they were financed by the Kali cartel to get into power at the same time. So I think that lots of things on the football pitch are starting to decline, but also the country is in a very bad moment as well. And the 1990 World Cup qualification doesn't really provide much of a relief because I don't think many people were particularly optimistic of the team doing well, particularly with the group in which they were allotted for the 1998 World Cup.
Colombia arrived to France for the 1998 World Cup with many of the 1990 and 1994 veterans, such as Valderrama, Wilmer Cabrera, Rincon, Asprilla, Serna, the Avila you mentioned, Aristizabal, Cordoba, Lozano, and Eltren Valencia, among others. Colombia are eliminated in the first round after two defeats against Romania and England and a narrow win over Tunisia. There was also the controversy of Asprilla being sent home for indiscipline. Was this the end of the Valderrama generation after a decade, starting from the 1987 Copa America and three straight World Cups?
I mean, I always see the 94 one as being the real end. Even though people like Valderrama and Esprilla are still there and Tren Valencia, as you mentioned, I just don't think they're anywhere near what they were. I think that in lots of ways, the players certainly define that generation, but I almost think that Francisco Matarrán, the coach, does so even more because I think he's the real intellect, the ideologue, the person that really brings it together. I don't think Bolillo Gomez was the same at that level. I mean, I've argued kind of previously elsewhere that Matarrana might well be one of the great black coaches. There are very few world famous black football coaches that have really made an impact on the game. So I always wonder if Matarrana might be one of them. So I think that the players that are still there from 1994 are definitely not the strength they once were. They've lost the pace, they've lost the creativity. Hamilton Ricard, who was a squad member, who was already at Middlesbrough, actually, in an interview afterwards said that, it was a very divided squad. There were a lot of factions. And when Asprilla got taken off in the first game against Romania, again, Romania, once again, the bête noire of Colombia, after 94, when they, beat them 3-1 the first game, they beat them 1-0 here as well. It's a great goal by Adrian Ilié, actually. So kind of Romania, almost to the team that Colombia I don't think would ever want to play again. So Asprilla got subbed. He makes some comments about certain players being untouchable. Bolillo kicks him out. But obviously, that doesn't just end with Asprilla going. There's a lot of resentment in the rest of the team. The Tunisia game is very unconvincing. It's the only goal they score in the whole tournament is scored by Leider Preciado. That's really the only moment of glory he really has in his career. He is one of those forwards that Colombia try, discard. There's lots of them that will follow in the next 10 years. So it's a team that is well past its sell-by date. The Romania team is decent. And England win very, very comfortably in that game. There's a Beckham free kick, one of those classic Beckham moments. It's a good England team. Colombia never really are in the game. So I think I see that Colombia team as being very much the whisper of what had been. It's a sad remnant of the glories of the late 80s and early 90s. I think their best times are, 3 or 4 years already gone, in my opinion.
Following the 1998 World Cup, Javier Alvarez was appointed as the national team manager to lead Colombia in this post Valderrama era. The team reached the quarterfinals of the 1999 Copa America that included the epic win over Argentina 3-0, which is remembered for the Argentine Martin Palermo missing three penalty kicks during the match. However, Alvarez was on his way out after this. What was the outlook as Colombia approached the millennium?
So this is really the start of a concerted attempt to make a transition. I think that they really have realised that they can't maintain these glories of the past. You know, Valderrama's retired, Asprilla is still playing, but really past it. So there is also, I think, a frustration of the slow play that Colombia have. I think the aspects of dynamism that Colombia's toque, kind of passing style has slightly been lost. So there is a sense of trying to regenerate not just the playing squad, but also the style. So Alvarez, who is brought in, is a risk in lots of ways, but he has been a coach in the under 17s and under 20s. And actually, Colombia has this phase of really looking to coaches who have done quite well with junior teams to try and perform this transition. There's also, an idea of trying to change the style. We've seen that Alvarez had been a coach at Once Caldas. They'd done quite well in the Libertadores, had beaten River Plate. So he was seen as the next up and coming coach. I think the problem is that the transition that he tries to achieve, the players that he uses are all quite young, and not many of them end up being up to it. If you look at that 1999 Copa America squad, there are very few players that will go on to have a particularly significant career, either for Colombia but also in Europe. Most of the team are playing in Colombia. There are a couple in Europe. You've got Ricard still. Bermudez is at Boca Juniors. There's Jorge Bolaño is playing reasonably well in Parma, but a lot of the young players are still in Colombia. They don't have that experience. And really only, well, Bolaño, maybe Alexander Viveros go on to have,
I think Mario
successful.
Yepes, he has a
Oh
fair
yeah,
shot
well
of decent
he's
career in
coming
Europe.
up. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
certainly coming up. But and you've got Ivan Cordoba as well. They're the two leaders. But they are really the backbone that make it, but no one else really does. And once again, I think that you have some hopes there, but no one really follows through. In terms for Alvarez, the problem that he has is not actually in that Copa America per se. They do well, as you say, they beat Argentina, they beat Uruguay as well. It's a very tough group. They do very well. There wasn't really much despondency at losing in Chile on the face of it, but then you look at the fact that Salas and Zamorano weren't playing, so it wasn't quite as good a result as you think. The real problem actually for Alvarez comes just after this. There is a qualification for the Olympic Games that he is also put in charge of, and they get absolutely battered by Brazil 9-0.
Oh yes.
So this is called the Londrinazo because it happens in Londrina, and it's such a disaster. It's such an abysmal performance that really puts an end to Alvarez as a manager. And actually, it's seen as being the most humiliating defeat probably in Colombian football, even if it happens at a kind of under 23 level. But I think it's worth remembering that in South America, those junior tournaments, whether that's an under 17 and under 20 World Cup, the Olympic qualifying are really important. They certainly get a lot more coverage than they do in Europe. So that was just a horrific failure. It's tantamount of a country that's going completely wrong. If we're looking for a symbol of what that defeat is, given what's happening in Colombia at the time as well. So yeah, it's again a kind of the first failure of regeneration, I think, is a good way of summarizing the Alvarez year or two in charge.
In the year 2000, Luis Augusto Garcia was appointed to lead Colombia for the 2002 World Cup qualifiers. By now, the national team included the likes of Ivan Cordoba and Yepes in defense and Juan Pablo Angel up front. Garcia would resign in May 2001 with Pacho Maturana returning to pick up the pieces. Colombia just missed out on goal difference on a playoff spot for the World Cup. Was it clear at this point that Colombia of the recent past was no longer?
Yeah, I mean, I think really the whole of the first decade of the 2000s is that. It's always Colombia trying to find a formula to replicate what had happened in the past. And unfortunately, there are always pieces missing. We have some very good defenders at this time in Cordoba and Yepes. Someone like Luis Amaranto Perea will eventually develop as well. Someone Juan Pablo Angel is an interesting one because he doesn't play anywhere near as much as you would think. I think he plays something like 30 games for Colombia. His record isn't amazing. Part of that comes to the fact that he was often injured. Part of it comes down to the fact that he didn't start well at Aston Villa, so he's kind of not playing for a little while. There's also the kind of almost like a merry-go-round of coaches who, again, can't find the precise spell to find, the magic formula to solve the problems. I think as well, you can just say, are the midfielders there? We can certainly see there's no real centre midfielder in the quality of Valderrama, who was often so influential. Colombia don't produce that kind of playmaker, I think. So there's always missing pieces. Chiqui Garcia, Luis Augusto Garcia, is a very controversial coach in Colombia as well. He is very fiery. He had a very nasty spat in the early 1990s when he was, I think, at Millonarios, and another coach accused him of helping to fix games for the cartel. That happened again. He had more criticism of that later on. So he is certainly a very controversial figure. He also falls out with Freddy Rincon. So the last great figure of that, golden generation goes due to, in a very ignominious way. It's quite a sad way of one of Colombia's greatest players to end his career. So I think that all of that qualifying, although it starts very well, there's a draw against Brazil. They beat Uruguay at home. So there's some good results there, but equally there are some disappointing ones. Argentina beat them very comfortably in both games, 3-1 and 3-0. They only draw against Ecuador, for example. They lose to Paraguay in a couple of key games. So it's a period of where no one has come through, apart from Yepes and Cordoba, to take those key spots to replace those biggest names. And again, I think much of what Colombia does on the football pitch often seems to replicate the national situation. Again, there's a period where there is an attempted peace process with the FARC that falls apart as well. The paramilitaries are still a real problem. So much as that, the problems on the pitch aren't being solved, the problems in the country aren't being solved either. So I think this is really the whole of the 2000s, the first decade, is a period of general despondency, both politically, socially, and on the football pitch.
However, Colombia won much needed silverware in the year 2001 by winning the Copa America at home. And it must be said that this was a Copa that was missing Argentina, who opted out due to security fears, and a struggling Brazil with a new manager, Felipe Scolari. Colombia won all its matches without conceding a goal. How was this victory regarded in sport and cultural terms at the time?
So Colombia really needs this. They're hosting it for a long time. The tournament actually looks like it might not be hosted there. There have been various bomb attacks in very major cities, in Medellin, in Cali, in Bogota as well. There is a lot of consternation within CONMEBOL about whether the tournament should be held there. The final straw comes when Hernan Mejia Campuzano, who is the vice president of the Colombian Football Federation, is kidnapped by the FARC. So actually, at that point, the tournament is due to be taken away from Colombia, which would be a disaster. The particular president, Andres Pastrana, has staked a lot of his political capital on holding the tournament in Colombia. He's been calling it the Cup of Peace. He's been talking about it being a way of showing a different idea of Colombia. But all of these things that are going on in the country makes it look that these are just empty words. But we see a very strong diplomatic effort. He goes to, I think, Asuncion to talk to the CONMEBOL kind of governing board himself. In actual fact, he's very lucky because the sponsors of the tournament aren't willing to change either. So the tournament goes ahead really almost by default. But a lot of people are very worried. As you said, Argentina don't go. Canada, who have been invited, also don't go. Brazil do go, but Ronaldo, Rivaldo aren't playing. Zamorano isn't there. Chilavert doesn't go. So this is a tournament that's shorn of many of its biggest stars. And actually, the teams that actually do well are the teams that have been invited to replace the teams that should have been there. So Costa Rica have quite a good tournament, but the surprise team are Honduras, who I think get through to the semi-final. And because they replaced Argentina, and then Argentina get generally despised. There's a lot of bad press in Colombia about Argentina. They're cowards. They're not turning up. There's a lot of hate towards them. Honduras kind of get adopted as being, look, this is what would have happened if you've come. We love you because you came and helped out the tournament. So you get this kind of massive support for Honduras throughout the tournament, particularly when they beat Brazil as well, which is one of those really weird Copa America games, but it becomes very famous. The tournament in Colombia, for Colombia itself, is very successful. There is a real decline in violence at the time. The stadiums are a real party atmosphere, and all of Colombia feels like it's trying to make a massive effort to show, certainly South America and hopefully the world, that it is capable, that is trying to change, that the country is welcoming, is happy, is hospitable. And I think it's really important to say that Colombia is all of those things. You know, it does have its problems, but the people, the atmosphere, the willingness to help, there are so many great things about Colombia that people don't know. And I think it's always really important to say that. So this tournament, is successful for Colombia in that way, but it's certainly not the strongest one. But because Colombia obviously win the final, they beat Mexico 1-0. Ivan Ramiro Cordova scores the goal. I mean, I think he really should be much more in the conversation about Colombia's greatest ever players, just because of the consistency, his career at Inter Milan. He's very unfortunate that in many ways the rest of the squad is not as successful, is not as good as him. So he's really one of the main guards in a very weak decade in which he's unfortunately plays for Colombia. But that particular win, him being there, scoring the goal in the final, being, the leader of the defence, certainly in my mind makes him an absolutely huge figure in Colombian football history, particularly as this is and remains the only tournament, continentally or globally, male or female, that Colombia has actually won. It's a kind of a weird tournament in lots of ways. The final, for example, is disrupted by parachutists who get there late and land on the pitch in the fifth minute. The president is always trying to talk about the cup of peace all the time. We see this real football as the opening of the masses, football as being highly mobilized as part of this peace effort by a president whose peace attempt with FARC will completely end in failure, where the FARC don't turn up and there's this empty chair at these supposed peace talks. It becomes quite emblematic of Pastrana's failure. He's also kind of given, it's always quoted as an area the size of Switzerland over to the FARC as part of the peace process. So, right, we won't attack you there, that's your area. But almost that enables FARC to consolidate themselves. So that effort is highly criticized in Colombia as well. So this kind of short period of time in July where, suddenly the country is doing everything it can to show itself to be well, to be peaceful, to be welcoming. We have a squad that's winning. And it's not a great squad either. Again, if you look at the team of that squad of 20 odd, you've got Cordoba, Oscar Cordoba is still there, the goalkeeper from 1994. But then there's not many other great figures. Freddy Grisales, Totonio Grisales has a good kind of period. Gerardo Bedoya is mostly known for being one of the players that's most been sent off in his career, something like 40 odd times. Victor Aristizabal has a great tournament, scores a lot of goals. He has a very successful career in Brazil, for example. But a lot of the other names just wouldn't be known. So it's a remarkable achievement in many ways, but it really is also one of the only successes that Colombia will have in that particular decade.
Maturana left after the World Cup qualifiers, and in 2002, Reinaldo Rueda was appointed. But before the end of the year, Maturana was reappointed. Once the 2006 World Cup qualifiers in the year 2003 looked bleak, Maturana resigned again. And Reinaldo Rueda was reappointed again for the remainder of the qualifiers and stayed until 2006. Colombia once again just missed on a playoff spot behind Uruguay, though they did reach the semifinals of the 2004 Copa America. How are these inconsistent years regarded?
Yeah, it's part of the period of weak teams, of uncertain style, of managerial rotation, of people coming and going, of trying to find a formula to be successful. It's a very weak time. I mean, the 2004 Copa America, it's one of those tournaments where you look again at what their group was. They were in a group with Peru, Bolivia, and Venezuela. It couldn't have been easier. They drew with Peru 2-2. They only beat Bolivia and Venezuela 1-0. They beat Costa Rica in the quarterfinals. So again, it's not exactly a tournament there. They're beating the hardest teams. As soon as they come against someone good, Argentina in the semi-finals, they lose 3-0, and they lose to Uruguay in the fourth place playoff. So it's not a great era. I just think that so many things are going wrong in Colombia in terms of its organization, in terms of its management. The club game is also in flux in lots of ways. We see some of the big teams struggling. It's a period where some of the smaller teams, like Once Caldas, who I know we're going to go on to talk about, but Boyacá Chico, Real Cartagena, teams are emerging and then disappearing, and the money that was in the game is starting to go as well. Again, a lot of the Colombian players are not going to Europe as well. I think that when Colombia has tended to be successful, we see some of those players in major teams. But the kind of players that Colombia has for most of this World Cup qualifying for 2006, they don't really go anywhere. I mean, Edwin Congo, for example, goes to Real Madrid but never plays. Plays a little bit in the Spanish league here and there. John Villafara, again, will play in Portsmouth and Southampton. So, but he is one of the players that is a success in Europe. But that's the level of success. It's not really, at a very important level. We do have Ivan Cordoba, but then Cordoba doesn't play in the 2004 Copa America. So, again, it's an attempt to try and find players. It's an attempt to try and find leaders. The great players they need don't emerge in this particular time. And even though there are odd moments of success, there are so many disappointing games as well. They lose to Venezuela at home 1-0, which is inexcusable. I think that generally, whenever a Colombian coach loses or even draws against Venezuela, that almost feels like the beginning of the end for that particular coach. They draw 0-0 in the second leg. So, and that really cost them the qualification in many ways. So, it's right in the middle of a very disappointing period of Colombian football. They're not a good team. There are no real leaders. The only real glory is the Once Caldas Copa Libertadores tournament in 2004.
Yeah, and in this 2004 Copa Libertadores, they defeated Boca Juniors, Once Caldas. What was the historical impact of this triumph?
This is the other great thing that happens in that first decade of the 2000s. The Copa America is one, Once Caldas is the other one. It is, I think, possibly the greatest shock in Copa Libertadores history. Although there have been a couple of other clubs like Independiente del Valle who might compete with that. But Caldas, although being a historic team of Colombia, aren't one of the big six or seven, maybe they're seventh or eighth team. One of their kind of predecessor teams did win the league in 1950, the third ever El Dorado League. So there is a history of some success, but this is a team from a provincial town. It's a team that doesn't have any big figures. But what they do have is a huge degree of hard work. They have a very, very good coach who is highly organized, who really teaches them well. It's a guy called Luis Fernando Montoya, a real kind of expert of how to get the best out of players, how to organize, how to make the most out of everybody. So I think that's really the link to the success. 2004 is a really weird year in the world football, actually. You have Werder Bremen win the German league, one of the few times that Bayern Munich don't. Valencia win in Spain, one of the few times that Barcelona or Real Madrid don't. Porto under Mourinho become the Champions League winners. Greece win the Euros. Cienciano, an absolutely unheralded team in Peru, win the Recopa Sudamericana. So it's a really weird year for football. It almost feels like Leicester should have won the league in England in that year as well to have really got the full suit. But what Once Caldas do is be extremely hardworking, extremely united. They even manage it without, this great striker. They have a guy called Sergio Galvan Rey, who for a long time was the leading scorer in Colombian football. He actually leaves to go to the MLS after the group phase. So they lose the guy that's their historic player, the top scorer in the Colombian league for a long time. I think Dairo Moreno has just broken that record. So they do it without him as well. And they're beating some good teams. They beat Vélez Sarsfield from Argentina in their group. They beat Santos, the Brazilian team, in the last eight. They're very good away. They keep it always very tight. They hardly ever lose. And then they're good at just keeping it tight and scoring a crucial goal or winning in penalties. The same thing happens against Sao Paulo in the semi-final. So they've got there on merit as well. They've beaten two of the best Brazilian teams of the time. And, even though maybe that Boca Juniors team is possibly slightly on the wane, they've had a very, very strong period, Boca Juniors, but some of their best players have gone by then. They still have people like Abondancieri in goal. They have Barros they have Burdizo, but some of their better players have gone by now. But just the fact that they won is absolutely remarkable. It's a triumph of effort. The goalkeeper is phenomenal throughout. John Villafara owes his career in Europe to that particular team as well. The sad thing about it all, and I think one of the saddest kind of postscripts is again what happens to the coach afterwards. So only about, I think it's about 10 days after they've lost the Intercontinental Cup very narrowly, there's an incident in his home city where he's mugged, or there's an attempted mugging. His wife is attempted to be mugged, and he's shot twice. And this leaves him effectively paralyzed. He doesn't die, but he can't move his arms or legs. And really, that's the end of his kind of football career to all extents and purposes. Apart from the fact that he fights on, he becomes this figure of resistance, of keeping going. He does various qualifications, he does lectures, he coaches young Colombian coaches. So he becomes this hugely important figure in terms of how the violence of Colombia can impact people, but also how people will always fight on and prove that they can go on. There is a Colombian word called berraquera, which is this idea of hard work, of struggle, of showing resistance, of keeping going, of positivity. So I think that Luis Fernando Montoya becomes emblematic of that. I think that probably he would have ended up being a Colombian national team coach. I wonder how successful he would have been with the squad that they had at the time. But certainly he is very fondly remembered. He is seen very fondly as a figure as a great Colombian. And that team was emblematic of what Colombian teams could be if they worked hard, if they tried hard, if they made the most of every ability they had. Particularly when we have a country that is really struggling with, ongoing violence in this time as well. So yeah, it's an incredibly significant moment for the country in lots of ways, and a very important memory as well.
The 2007 Copa America under new manager Jorge Luis Pinto was disastrous, and Colombia fared even worse in the 2010 World Cup qualifiers, started by Pinto and finished under the stewardship of Eduardo Lara. Hernan Dario Gomez returned to the helm in 2010 and managed in the 2011 Copa America. He resigned following the tournament after punching a woman in a bar. This led to the short interim by Leonel Alvarez. Were Colombia in dire straits at this point?
Absolutely. I mean, I could almost leave it just there. Terrible straits. I think both the football and the nation as well. Not only do we have continuing violence with the FARC, with paramilitaries, there are certain moments of hope. There is a very hardline right wing president called Alvaro Uribe, who's been a very controversial figure since. But he's been heavily linked to the paramilitaries. He was found guilty in Colombian courts very recently. He does notionally get the paramilitaries to demobilize during his term in government, but whether they really demobilize is a different question. We also have eventually the scandal of the false positives, which is where the Colombian army were effectively kidnapping either people off the streets or people looking for jobs and then murdering them and then putting them in kind of FARC fatigues to make it look like they'd killed members of the FARC. So that scandal emerges as well. So, on that national level, there is a lot of problem. We also have a problem of paramilitaries. It comes out that various paramilitary leaders like Macaco, like Jorge Cuarenta, various others were also laundering money through Colombian clubs. A lot of these are teams in the B division, the second division in Colombia. That particular league at the time is very poorly managed and invigilated. We have a lot of clubs that will appear, they will have a cupo, they will have their franchise, but then they will disappear again and the cupo or the franchise will be passed on to somewhere else. So it feels like there is a lack of oversight, a lack of due care and attention to what's going on. So there's a lot of money laundering, and it does affect some of the major clubs as well. Santa Fe get into trouble too. So do Pereira. We also have the situation where Envigado are heavily linked to the drug cartels. They fall under what's called the Clinton list. So do America de Cali, one of Colombia's great teams. So both of those clubs, their assets, their money is frozen. Players like Willington Ortiz, who have links with America de Cali and also apparently the cartel, are also under pressure. So all of those things are going on with criminality, with paramilitarism, with violence, with disaster in the country. And really, again, it's the team is very much like that. Again, we have a lack of success. We have a real struggle in qualification campaigns. The leadership merry-go-round carries on. No one really seems to find a method. And it's not really until the end of that qualifying campaign where actually the green shoots start to appear. So if you look in the last 4 or 5 games, after they've lost 2-0 to Venezuela, which is an absolute disaster, you then start seeing players that will become the reference points in the second golden generation starting to appear. So, for example, Radamel Falcao scores a goal that wins the game against Peru. Jackson Martinez and Teofilo Gutierrez score the goals that beat Ecuador. And Giovanni Moreno scores a goal against Chile, even though Colombia lose against Chile. Adrian Ramos, who will have a very successful career in Europe, also starts to score. So you see at least the strikers starting to emerge. James Rodriguez isn't in there yet, but other key figures like Abel Aguilar, Luis Amaranto Perea, for example, are starting to play. So at least right at the end of the 2010 campaign, we do see some of those players emerging. It's worth also noting, really, that the 2010 World Cup is only really approved in Colombia because I think that's the one from memory that Shakira sings at and Juanes sings at in the opening ceremony. So that's the only way in which Colombia is at that particular World Cup. I think it's that one. But there are a few signs occurring right at the end that things might be about to change. Although maybe that's a little bit retrospective potentially.
Finally, the decision that changed Colombia's fortunes. Former Argentina manager Nestor Jose Pekerman was appointed in 2012 to lead the team in the 2014 qualifiers. Incidentally, I just did a podcast on Pekerman's career just a few weeks back. Now, Pekerman would transform the team with the emergence of players such as Radamel Falcao and James Rodriguez. How did Peckerman change the team's tactics and environment to achieve World Cup qualification for 2014?
So I think one of the important things is to note that the country felt like it was ready for a foreign coach again. I was talking to a few friends about this period, and they were saying that pretty much every coach they'd had for that last decade or so had been Colombian, and there'd been consistent failure. But what was also people were aware of is that there were quite a few Colombians who were already playing in Argentina and were doing well with Argentinian coaches. Teofilo Gutierrez is one of those, for example. Radamel Falcao has a successful period there as well. So James Rodriguez too. So there is a thought that we need to go abroad to find a coach. So I think that acceptance of we need someone to come and help sort us out is definitely beneficial for him. I think what's also important is that there is a slightly new mood. Colombia has hosted the 2011 Under 20 World Cup, again, a very major tournament in lots of ways. There is a generally an impressive effort in that game, and that's where we see some of the other figures starting to emerge. So James Rodriguez appears in that tournament. Luis Muriel, who has a successful career, appears in that tournament. Santiago Arias, who is a very good right back, will eventually play in Europe, in Holland, for example, is in that tournament, as are Duvan Zapata, Jason Murillo. So things are starting to come together with the players. And again, we see a lot more players now playing abroad as well. There is also starting to be a new idea of Colombia looking for peace. Now, this is something that is very much my book. In my book, talking about how the Colombian president, Juan Manuel Santos, starts to employ football for peace narratives, unifying narratives. In lots of ways, it starts in 2011 with that Junior World Cup. There is a lot of nation branding, of advertising, of trying to increase Colombian tourism. We have the Colombia es Pasión, Colombia is Passion kind of advertising campaign. There are various other campaigns that will follow suit. So Peckerman comes in an era where we have a new national feeling of potential hope with a president that is branding the country in a different way and is starting to talk about peace with the FARC. We also have the elements in place in terms of young footballers who are doing well and getting success in Europe and becoming, I suppose, increasingly professionalized. And I think we also have all the key elements that you really might need. The one last piece is probably the goalkeeper. There is a little bit of a struggle to find a goalkeeper, but when David Ospina comes in, then I think really you have almost every type of position that you might want. In terms of the tactics, there is a little bit of variation. He does experiment. There is generally a 4-2-2-2 system. Sometimes it moves to a 4-4-1-1. There are some occasional criticisms that they might have been a little bit defensive at certain times in the bigger games. But what is happening is that suddenly they're scoring goals again. That was the problem for most of the previous decade. Players like Hamilton Ricard, Leda Preciado, even Juan Pablo Angel never really fulfill that role. But when you have people like Teofilo Gutierrez, Jackson Martinez, Radamel Falcao scoring the goals, and then you have James Rodriguez who's capable of creating them as well, suddenly you have all the elements that you really want. Mario Yepes is getting on a bit, but what you also have is people like Zapata, Christian Zapata, you have Zuniga as well. Pablo Armero has become a successful left back. So I think that it's all of these nice kind of things are falling into place at a similar time. So I think that's why, in lots of ways, Peckerman becomes very successful. But I think you have to put it to, what you have to credit him with is having a lot more experience than many of the Colombian coaches did, obviously having managed Argentina before as well. He feels like the right person, the right time, and someone that the country is prepared to get behind. And he also starts well, which also helps. So there's lots of nice things falling into place at the start of Peckerman's time in charge.
In the lead up to the 2014 World Cup, Radamel Falcao, who was regarded as Colombia's main asset, was injured and would be out of the World Cup. In the World Cup itself, it would be James Rodriguez who would become a global star and end up at Real Madrid. What was the impact of this World Cup after 16 years of absence?
Absolutely huge. This is one of those things I could probably talk for several hours about. It's pretty much the whole of my book. So again, thanks for advertising at the start. So if anyone's interested in this in more detail, you can download it for free. Please look up Football and Nation Building in Colombia, the only thing that unites us. It's really important. It's not just the fact that they play really well. It's not just the fact they score lots of goals. It's not just the fact that they play in a way that is appealing, that is exciting, that is full of flair. It's not just the fact that they have these dancing celebrations that start to create a new image. It's also everything that's going on in the country at the same time. So we also have a period where there are lots of peace negotiations with the FARC going on, and it seems like the process is advancing very seriously, very well. There is suddenly a hope that the conflict can end. We have a president that is staking his whole reputation on this peace process. It also feels that the FARC have been backed into a corner where they have to go for peace. It also feels that they're more serious about the process. So I think the social and political process and the football, success is really converging. I think that what's important for Colombia is not that it's important just for themselves. They see their players having their best ever historic World Cup. It's their best ever. They get to the quarterfinals. They've beaten Uruguay. They've thrashed Greece. They've thrashed Japan. They beat Ivory Coast very comfortably. They're very unlucky against Brazil. I think that most people who watch that game, although the most infamous moment is probably Zuniga injuring Neymar. If you look at the rest of the game, James Rodriguez is kicked out of the game. Probably Brazil were treated really, really leniently by the referee from Spain, who was heavily criticised. There's also the Colombian legend of, fue gol de Yepes. It was a goal by Yepes, who has a goal disallowed in that game. For Colombians, absolutely, incorrectly, of course. So, even the loss is not one that can be blamed on Colombia. They lost to Brazil. It feels like the referee was fixing it. So they're blameless. Everything they've done in this World Cup is perfect. As you've said, James scores a great goal against Uruguay that becomes the Puskas goal that year as well. It's a kind of a perfect moment in lots of ways for Colombia at that time, for the people, but also for showing the world what Colombia was. It's a tournament that for many will dispel some of the negative images that were certainly very, very prevalent at the time of the 1990-94 World Cups. The narrative is different here. All of the news reports are talking about the fact that Colombia is going for peace, that it can get to peace. So it's a real time of hope, and the football team really mirrors that.
Speaking of Radamel Falcao, it's such a shame this injury that kind of slowed down his career because he was very much in an upwards trajectory. He had joined Monaco, who at the time were spending a lot of money on players. Yes, subsequently, he had very short spells at both Manchester United and Chelsea. He struggled in both of those spells. In a way, the rest of his career was marked by this injury.
I think that's
Although he
fair.
did return to Monaco and won the league title with Mbappe, but still, it was not the same Falcao
Yeah.
as before.
Yeah, a lot of that dynamism had gone, and he was a real hero. I mean, he's also a very I'm not sure if anyone has anything bad to say about Falcao in Colombia. He is a real hero. He's a great guy. He stands up at the right time. He says the right things. He's been very supportive of the women's football, which is starting to become a very important team in its own right. They've also had a very good period of growth in this period of time. They were at the World Cup in 2011 for the first time. They also do well in 2015, the year after this particular men's World Cup team. So, Falcao not being at that World Cup was a real shame. It's not like Colombia were missing out, though. They still have people like Jackson Martinez, Teofilo Gutierrez. But you do wonder if Falcao had been there at its absolute height as a dynamic predator, goal scorer, creator of chances, a magnificent player at his peak, then maybe things would have been different. Could they have beaten Brazil? Certainly the Brazil that could get nervous and certainly was nervous in that game. I think what's lovely about Falcao, at least, is that the fact that he did get to play in 2018, even though he was past his peak, and at least he did score in that tournament as well. So I think that was a really nice way for his career to end. And I think he was the one. It's the only disappointing thing about 2014 was that Falcao wasn't there.
Looking on balance, how would you compare the 1990s adventures with this 2014 World Cup on and off the field?
So I think politically, Colombia is in a much better place. So I think a lot of the narratives that are putting hope onto the Colombia team of the 1990s and 1994 were built on sand. They were only narratives that were hoping and rather utopian and thinking about almost displacing reality. 2014, however, we have a much more country that is doing more active things to solve its own problems politically. Unfortunately, as we can see, all of these things haven't been solved, but then there are too many problems going on. But at least at that time, there was a lot more hope. I think that the players themselves were much more professional. I think that they were much more reliable. I don't think you have the loose cannons like Asprilla, like De Avila, who could cause problems at the same time. Partially that is because Colombia and its footballers were much more exposed to European and South American coaching, much more professionalism. That experience, that seriousness was certainly there. I think we can put Maturana and Peckerman on the same level. I think that they are two obviously great coaches that have been the two great coaches of Colombian football. I don't think there's really much to distinguish them. Because in lots of ways, Peckerman returns to a lot of that Colombian style that Maturana had created. That kind of flair, the hard work in the right areas, the passing, the joy, the representativity of a team that seemed to represent all of Colombia in the type of players that were there. So I think that's really the difference in that the country feels like it's based on solider ground. There is a lot more potential progress, and so is the team in lots of ways. I think that the 1990s team, or the late 80s, 90s team, though, is the blueprint. That's where what Colombian football could be is certainly established. And that's why that generation is so important. So I think, 2014 is the return to those times in lots of ways, but enhancing it in many ways due to the added professionalism, the added awareness of what the international game really needed and that experience to be able to perform on that very high level. So I think that's how I would compare the two.
Why do you think the team stagnated for so long? Is it perhaps they did not have a central figure like Valderrama? Could you make comparisons with Peru following the end of the Tofio Cubillas generation in the 1980s?
Yeah, I think it's the things we've said. It's struggling to find a solid coaching project. It's also based on a league that had very flimsy foundations. I think that the league struggled in many ways with the corruption involved. It had to remake itself. I think a lot of the systems and networks in Colombia football often prevented talent coming out. I think that the Football Federation in Colombia has had a lot of problems and still does. Certainly, there is always an absence of players in key positions. At some time, it's forwards. I think the whole of the 2000s before 2010 is definitely in midfield. I think that you struggle to find really, really good midfielders in Colombia at the time. After a particular period of time, the good goalkeepers disappear as well. And I think as well, you can look to a country that is just in the doldrums. I think it's quite common as well in South America, for the fourth or fifth team of the continent. If you see Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay as traditionally being the top three, someone like Peru has a little bit of a golden phase. Chile has a little bit of a golden phase in the end of the 90s, and then certainly again in the mid 2010s. Ecuador has a nice little phase in the early 2000s. Paraguay, has again a kind of couple of good years in the 80s and 90s. So it feels like there are kind of sporadic periods where teams rise and fall, but often the groundwork, the bases that you need to be consistently successful aren't always there. And I think the problem with the 1980s and 90s in Colombia is that the ground issues of what Colombian success was at the time was based on was very flimsy, was going to break as soon as the cartels and criminality got exposed. And then the lack of professionalism and organization also collapses. So 2014 becomes successful because you have a greater degree of seriousness. You have players in every position, crucially, and you have that European experience at the time. Very few players in the 2000s and late 1990s are going to Europe and being successful. And I think, unfortunately, South American football often needs that. Certainly to compete in the global tournaments anyway. I think certainly in the Americas with the Copa Libertadores, you might be able to compete if certain factors go, if certain teams are being weakened, if certain players are going to Europe, then you can compete, but not on a global level. And I think that's where Colombia struggled, particularly as all of those other countries in that decade do have more of their important players playing in Europe, for example.
So this 2014 World Cup will be regarded as a reference point in the upturn of the Colombian national team's fortunes.
Absolutely. Yeah, without doubt. It's the best men's tournament. It remains that. 2018 isn't quite as successful, not quite the same side, arguably a bit too defensive. I think what's interesting is that the women's team, arguably for the last 5 years, have been the Colombian reference point for football. But I think in some ways, it's great that that other national team, that other selection has been able to build on this football tradition and provide similar types of narratives. But, if you look at what football needs to be a national reference point and a symbol for national identity, everything's there. You have heroic figures that represent crucial parts of what Colombians are, whether that is Afro Colombians, more Central Colombians. The one figure that wasn't there is the indigenous Colombian. Luis Diaz certainly does come into that area now. But you have also it always, when you're remembering that, you're remembering lots of positive things: the dancing, the goal against Uruguay. When Farid Mandragon, who's something like 42 or 43, comes on in one of the games for the last moments to become the oldest player in the World Cup. All of those things are united to a country that had hope, that had optimism, and had a chance for peace. So I think that all of those things conflate to become a really significant reference point that will continue being remembered for decades as a strong period for Colombia, or a time of hope for Colombia, in which football became very representative of that national desire for unity, for pride, for a different type of international recognition.
Which is looked upon as more significant in this era? The 2001 Copa America triumph, the 2004 Copa Libertadores of Once Caldas, or qualifying for the 2014 World Cup?
So they're all very key reference points. I think that 2001 always comes with caveats because of the teams that weren't there, and because of the fact that it felt like the tournament, they were hosting it. Brazil weren't very good. Argentina weren't there. There are some problems with it, but it's still the only international tournament Colombia has won. So that will always be vital. It'll always be important, even if, for example, some of the heroes that become very representative aren't there. So I think that's important. Once Caldas is a triumph of Colombian character. The problem with that one could be that it's a club team rather than a national team. But what's also important about Once Caldas is that they're not a team that people hate. People can always hate Nacional, Millonarios, América de Cali, Santa Fe, because they're the big clubs, they're linked with these problematic histories. Once Caldas don't really have that. They're a provincial team. They can be very seen as a symbol of
It's like
what
a
Colombia.
Cinderella story, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good story, and no one really will dislike them. And again, with someone like Montoya as the coach as well, what happened with him, there's a lot of positives that come with that. 2014, in terms of a national symbol for the world, because I think that's important, because it's not a triumph, obviously, but it is a triumph in many ways. It's an important moment for Colombia in the world, in the global game, which possibly the Once Caldas and 2001 Cup wins aren't. And I think that it ties in with slightly more important national narratives as well. And I think that the heroes that are there in 2014 There are more of them. They're a lot more representative. So possibly for that reason, 2014 might be the most significant. But I think all of them are crucial moments due to what they represent, and most crucially, what exactly the time was socially, politically, and historically at Colombia at the time. All of those things are relevant because of the climate in the country that's going on in the background. They're all associated in those different ways.
In closing, how are the years 1994 to 2014 looked upon in historical and cultural terms by Colombian football historians?
I think that it's the black hole. It's another black hole where Colombia is struggling to find its football identity. I think it's seen as being a time where the successes of the 1980s and 1990s have been wasted, where Colombia is trying to find its new generation, struggling to do so. I think it's a time where the problems within Colombian football structures and the federation itself are being exposed as being insufficient and poor or corrupt or disorganized. So I think that it's a time where the football team struggles to be a national reference point. It does, like I say, it does in 2001. Once Caldas certainly do in different ways in 2004. But generally, football is not being connected to the nation in the way in which it can create positive narratives of nation. And that's really what Colombia always hopes for. Because football is supposed to be a symbol that unites the country. And it really struggles to be that because of its lack of success. The fact that it's an Argentinian that manages to guide them to the 2014 successes, is slightly problematic in a way. But he's often seen as being an honorary Colombian. Certainly, the president, Santos offers him Colombian citizenship. He actually refuses it. So, in lots of ways, he is adopted. But it's not until 2014 that we really see Colombian football becoming a significant unifying device in a concerted fashion. And that's actually tied to more, I suppose, action processes where peace is being sought through methodologies, through political planning, and not just speeches or empty words. So I think that's what it is. That period of time is a period of struggle, a period where success is not found. It's this period where Colombia is relegated once again to the lower hierarchies of South American football, which it's always aspired to rise beyond. So it's not a great time. It's a very difficult time in lots of ways, and it is a difficult time for the country as well in terms of the FARC, the paramilitaries, massacres, corruption. All of those problems as well are part of how that whole time is remembered.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation for this interview. All our contact information and the link to Dr. Watson's book are listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Peter, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, and thanks very much for having me back on again.
Thank you.